All right, so our next section of the course is chapter 10, 11, and 12. So what I'm doing what I'm going to do for this section of the course is I'm going to share all the PowerPoints and all the videos for the next three chapters with you. And then at the end, there's one single Math Excel assignment on chapters 10, 11, and 12. So I'm going to do things a little differently with this section. We're going to see how it goes. Um, what I'm going to do today is in this video, I'm going to talk about chapter 10. I'm going to go through the PowerPoint, and then I'm going to do a couple of sample problems in Math Excel just so you get an idea of the types of questions you'll see in that Math Excel assignment at the end here. So let's start by going through the PowerPoint here. So chapter 10 is chapter 10 is about sampling methods. This section of the course is about basically we're going to learn about how a statistical study and experiment works, and what goes into putting a study together. This is very applicable to what we're going through right now. There are studies going on drugs for the coronavirus right now. So we're going to learn about the basics of how these studies work. Today we're going to focus simply on sampling, meaning how we choose participants in the study, because that is important. So the first things first. When we talk about a study, we want to know the difference between a population and a sample. And so a population, as it says here, is the whole group of people that we hope to learn about. So very often when a study is being conducted, it's humanly impossible to sample the entire population. So what they do is they select just a small sample from that population, and they use those results to make conclusions about the entire population. So the sample, and you can see in the visual here, is kind of just like a slice of the pie from the population. So the population is the whole group we hope to learn about. The sample is a small portion of that, and we use those results to make conclusions about the population. A census is when your sample is the entire population. 99.9% of the time, a census is impossible. It's just virtually impossible to do. Some of you might know the term census. If you've taken a government class before, you might know that every 10 years, the federal government conducts what they call a census. And really what it is it's a population count of all the people that are living in the United States. And they use the results of that census to map out congressional districts, stuff like that, to see which states are going up in population, which states are going down in population. They also use it to divvy up the electoral votes for the Electoral College in the presidential election. So that is what a census is. Now, in terms of this class, a census is, like I said, 99.9% of the time is just not feasible. The parameter, the last kind of important word, is a parameter. The parameter is what we hope to learn about or make conclusions about. So it's basically you have your population, you have your sample. The parameter is what you're studying. It could be a parameter could be the effectiveness of a medicine or the effectiveness of a test of a particular medical procedure. That would be like the parameter. What you're trying to make conclusions about. So I have an example just to give you an idea of what I talked about on this slide. Excuse me. So here's an example, and I took this. I kind of stole this from the textbook. So say we were trying to study the average ACT scores of high school students in Iowa. Okay. The population would be the high school students in Iowa. That's the group of people we are hoping to learn about. A sample might be I pick a few students at random from every high school. Okay. A census would be I literally sample every high school student in Iowa. Now, is that feasible? Probably not. That would be an example of a census. And in this case, the parameter would be the mean ACT score. Okay, so that's kind of an example of what I was talking about on the previous slide. Really, what the goal of any study, of any sample, is to avoid bias. Now, I know you all know what bias is. Okay, you all know what bias is. It's a word you've heard before. You want your results to be unbiased. And the bottom line is there are sampling methods that we're going to learn about later in this PowerPoint that just simply over or under emphasize certain characteristics. It could skew the results. We learned what that word means in previous chapters. And that's what you don't want. You want the results to be useful. So if you want the results to be useful, you want no bias. And the way to avoid bias is to make sure your samples are truly random. And we're going to talk about how to do that later. So that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid bias at all costs. Because let's face it, numbers can be spun to prove any point. So if you don't want to do that, then you want to have unbiased results. So now for the main purpose of this chapter, and that is the sampling methods. And I'm going to go through each of the methods one by one and explain what they mean. So the first one is what we call a simple random sample. And that's kind of self-explanatory. A simple random sample would simply be just as simple as closing your eyes, pulling a name from a hat, or drawing lottery numbers, or rolling dice, or anything that is truly random. That would be considered a simple random sample. Again, pretty self-explanatory. Okay. Another kind of popular sampling method is what we call a systematic sample. And if you look at the word, systematic sounds like system. So here was an example I gave, a visual example, where we have a population and the system used was to sample every third. We started with person number 2, and then they sampled every third person after that. Okay, that is what we call the system. So that is what we call a systematic sample. Could be every third, could be every other person, doesn't matter. There's some sort of system that you're going to stick to no matter what. All right. The next thing is a convenience sample. And a convenience sample is usually not very advisable. So an example of a convenience sample is the one here where you conduct an online poll, but you only survey your best friends. Are your friends likely to be representative of the entire population? Likely not. But this is still a sample that is used a lot, convenience sampling. Why do they call it convenience sampling? Because it's more convenient to survey your best friends. Again, not the best sampling method because it could potentially create bias. But like I said, it is one that is used a lot, convenience sampling. The next one is a voluntary response sample. And that is what it says in the name, a voluntary response sample. So in a voluntary response sample, you have a large group of individuals are invited to respond, and all who do respond are counted. So if you look at the bottom of the slide here, you notice I put the logos for American Idol and The Voice. Those are perfect examples of voluntary response samples. Okay, the people who watch the show are invited to vote for their favorite contestant, but the reality is only a select few of those actually end up voting. Another example of a voluntary response sample is like when you order something online, and very often you'll get an email that say, "Hey, please fill out this survey." And usually they'll say if you fill out this survey, you get 10% off your next purchase. That is a voluntary response sample. You have the option of either filling out the survey or declining to fill out the survey. Voluntary response samples are usually not advisable also because they're almost always biased. Um, Going back to the American Idol and The Voice example, um, if you have a contestant that you feel really strongly about, you're more likely to vote. Whereas if you don't care, if you're just a casual viewer of the program, you're probably less likely to vote. So that is going to create some sort of bias. So that's why voluntary response samples um, not advisable. We call this non-response bias or response bias. So um, again, if you're a casual viewer of the program and you don't really care, that might be a non-response bias because you're less likely to vote. Whereas if you really feel strongly about who should win the show, that would be an example of response bias. The next one is what we call a stratified sample or a stratified random sample. I shorten it to stratified. And a stratified can be kind of confusing. So in a stratified sample, you have a population, and this kind of gives a visual representation of how a stratified sample works. So you have an entire population, and you divide that population into groups. And then you pick and choose a few at random from each group. So an example might be maybe, so if you think about in school, students are naturally divided into groups. Each group could be a classroom, for example. So I have a classroom here, a classroom here, a classroom here. So I've divided the population into groups or classrooms, and maybe I'll pick one or two students at random from each classroom. So I have randoms, a couple from here, a couple from here, a couple from here, a couple from here. That is what we call a stratified sample. It's when you divide it into groups and then you choose a couple at random from each group. Stratified sample. The one that's most often confused with it is what we call a cluster sample. A cluster sample. A cluster sample is similar, but there is a very distinct difference. So in a cluster sample, you still take the population and you divide it into groups. That still happens. The difference being, whereas in a stratified sample, you're actually choosing one or two from each group, in a cluster sample, you're choosing a whole group at random. So to use the example I did a minute ago, if these groups, say, were classrooms in a school, instead of picking one or two from each classroom, I might pick a whole classroom at random. So I'm choosing a whole group at random. So in a stratified sample, you're choosing a few at random from each group. Whereas in a cluster sample, you're choosing whole groups at random. Okay. Here's an example that I actually stole from YouTube, believe it or not. That kind of might give you a better example of what the difference is between a stratified and a cluster sample, because those are the two samples that are most often confused by students because they involve um, dividing up into groups. So this was a good example that I came up with. So we have here here the population is a gigantic bag of Skittles, and to divide it up in groups, they divided up the Skittles by color. So instead of having classrooms, we divided the Skittles by color. So green, yellow, orange, so on and so forth. Okay. So our population is a bag of Skittles. I divide the Skittles into groups by color. So a stratified sample would mean, okay, I choose a few greens, a few yellows, a few oranges. I choose a few of each color at random. That would be a stratified sample. Whereas a cluster sample would be, I choose all of one color at random. So in this particular example, they chose the entire bowl of green Skittles at random. So in a stratified sample, I chose a few of each color. In a cluster sample, I choose an entire color at random. So that is the difference between a stratified and a cluster sample. Okay. So one of the things you want to be able to do in this chapter is to be able to be given a situation and then say, okay, what type of sample is it? Is it voluntary response? Is it a random sample? Is it a stratified sample? So on and so forth. So I have a few examples here. So we need to survey a random sample of the 300 passengers on a flight from San Francisco to Tokyo. Identify each sampling strategy. So number one, pick every 10th passenger as people board the plane. Which sampling method is that? The key is every 10th passenger. That is a system, hence a systematic sample. From the boarding list, randomly choose a few people from first class and a few people flying coach. Okay? That is going to be a stratified sample because you divide the passengers are divided into groups by first class and coach, and I chose a few from each group. That is by definition a stratified sample. Number three, gave away the answer there. Randomly generate 30 seat numbers and survey the passengers who sit there. Randomly generate. That is a simple random sample. Randomly generate. Number four, survey all people sitting in an aisle seat. Okay, so in this case, they're dividing the passengers up by groups by what seat they sit in, aisle or window. Here, they surveyed all people sitting in an aisle seat. So you're choosing a whole group. That's a cluster sample. Have the flight attendant ask for 50 people to volunteer to participate in the survey by pressing the call button at their seats. Key in this case, volunteer. Voluntary response sample. The flight attendant chooses the passenger sitting closest to his or her location. Key in this case, chooses the passenger sitting closest. That is more convenient. It's a convenience sample. Okay. And that is it for the PowerPoint. Now, what I want to do now, like I said, instead of doing a separate assignment for each chapter in this section, I am just going to do one assignment for chapter 10, 11, and 12 put together. So what I want to do is on that chapter 10, 11, and 12 assignment, there are, there are 12 questions, as you can see here. The first 3 questions are from chapter 10. So I'm actually going to go through those 3 questions from chapter 10, 1, 2, and 3, to give you an idea of how that works. My suggestion would be to do those 3 questions, number 1, number 2, number 3, like pause this video, do those 3 questions, and then come back and watch the remainder of this video. So if you want to pause right now, go and do the first 3 questions from the chapter 10, 11, and 12 assignment, and then come back. Feel free to do that. In the meantime, let's look at number 1 here on the Math Excel assignment. So for the following report, identify the population parameter of interest, sample, and the sampling method. So a U.S. consumer magazine asked all adult subscribers whether they had used psychiatric medical treatments, and if so, whether they had benefited from them. For almost all of the treatments, approximately 22% of those responding reported cures or substantial improvement in their condition. A, what is the population? Okay. And our choices are all adults in the country, those who do not use medical treatment. So what are they hoping to learn about? Well, remember, the population is what they're hoping to learn about. In this case, they're not studying people who don't use medical treatment. So the only one that makes sense is A, all adults in the country. B, what is the population parameter of interest? What are they looking at? So we have the proportion of the population who have used and benefited from psychiatric medicine, the proportion of population who have used and not benefited. Well, go back here. For almost all of the treatments, approximately 22% of those responding reported cures or substantial improvement. That to me means benefited. Okay. C, what is the sample for this study? All adults who have used psychiatric treatments and all subscribers who responded to the survey. So the sample was the U.S. Consumer Magazine asked all adult subscribers whether they had used psychiatric medical treatment. Okay, that is the people who responded to the survey. So they asked them to respond, but that doesn't mean they actually responded. So the sample is not the people who use psychiatric treatment. The sample are all the subscribers who actually responded. Okay. What sampling method was used? Again, they asked subscribers to respond, but not necessarily everyone responded. That is a classic voluntary response sample. And if we go back to the PowerPoint, is a voluntary response sample truly random? No, it is not. There's always bias involved. Okay, so that's the first question. Let's see, number 2. We're going to do the same thing. So define the public views on drinking and driving. Researchers waited outside a bar they had randomly selected from a list of such establishments. They stopped every 10th adult who came out of the bar and asked whether he or she thought drinking and driving was a serious problem. What is the population? Okay, all adults except those who work at bars or adults. Okay, well, go to the first part here. Define the public's view on drinking and driving. Okay, that doesn't imply those who work at bars, so it's going to be adults. The population parameter of interest. Okay, the proportion of adults who did not answer the survey, the proportion of adults who think drinking and driving is a serious problem. Okay, let's go back here. Researchers waited outside a bar they had randomly selected. They stopped every 10th adult who came out of the bar and asked whether he or she thought drinking and driving was a serious problem. B. The sample. They stopped every 10th adult. There we go. The sampling method. They stopped every 10th adult. That is a systematic sample. Any potentially sources of bias you can detect, and any problems you see in generalizing to the population of interest. Well, for me, when I read this, they're asking people whether they think drinking and driving is a serious problem, but they're asking people as they're leaving a bar. Think about that for a sec. That could skew the results. So undercoverage bias is possible. Since those interviews just left a bar, their opinions about drinking and driving may differ from the population in general. There we go. Let's go to the third question. Oops. All right, and same thing. Okay, so this is the same question. Essentially, researchers waited outside a bar they had randomly selected from such a list of establishments, stopped every eighth adult, and asked whether they thought drinking and driving was a serious problem. So it's the which one makes most sense? The population is all adults who would visit a bar. The population is the adults in the bar. That one makes more sense to me. What is the population parameter of interest? Yeah, we same as before. Adults, the proportion of adults who think drinking and driving is a serious problem. Okay. The sample was they stopped every eighth adult leaving the bar. Okay. This is a systematic sample. Is the sampling method used random? Could go either way. A systematic sample is more random than a, say, voluntary response sample. So as long as they kept to that actual system of asking every eighth adult, I would say that's random. Okay. And I would definitely disagree with that. Um, yeah, I would definitely disagree with that question because in this case, um, their population were the adults in the bar. So I would say that if you got marked wrong for that same reason on this question, I would override that to a correct answer. And that's the thing with this section is that a lot of these things are up to interpretation. So if it marks you wrong and you can give me a good reason that you think you're right, I will absolutely give you credit for this. So keep that in mind as you're doing this assignment. So those were the only three questions. Those are the only three questions on the assignment that are this from this chapter 10. So